Abraham, the father of nations, and the test that defined him. Before he was the father of nations, before his name echoed through thousands of years, before his story became the foundation of faith for millions across the world, Abraham was simply a man living in the ancient city of Ur. He was known as Abram then, neither young nor old, neither extraordinary nor insignificant. He lived a quiet life, surrounded by the towering ziggurats and bustling markets of a land filled with idols and rituals offered to gods carved from stone and wood. But even in those early days, something about him was different. Though the world around him bowed to lifeless statues, Abram's heart was restless, searching for something real, something alive. His nights were filled with questions. When the sky grew dark and the stars emerged like scattered jewels, Abram often stepped outside his home and looked up at the endless expanse above him. Something stirred in him when he gazed at those stars. It wasn't curiosity alone, it was recognition, as if something beyond the universe was calling to him, whispering truths he couldn't yet comprehend. Sarai, his wife, often watched him from a distance. She understood that quiet fire in him, though she couldn't explain it. Sarai loved Abram deeply, but there was a sorrow she carried quietly, a sorrow rooted in her barrenness. She knew that Abram longed for a child, an heir, a continuation of his name, and though he never blamed her, never spoke a single harsh word about it, she felt the weight of it pressing on her heart every day. Yet even with this longing, Abram lived a life marked by peace and stability. His family was well respected. He possessed livestock, wealth, reputation. He had everything a man in his time could desire, except the one thing that mattered most to him, a child of his own. And then one night, everything changed. Abram was asleep when a presence unlike anything he had ever known enveloped him. Gentle, powerful, infinite. A voice spoke, not through his ears, but through his soul, and it shook the very foundation of who he was. Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. The words vibrated through him, both terrifying and comforting, like fire that warmed rather than burned. Abram sat upright, his breath trembling. He didn't know where the voice came from, but he knew it wasn't a dream. It was real, more real than anything he had ever touched or seen. And then the voice spoke again, offering a promise, unlike any human promise ever spoken. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Abram felt his entire being tremble. A nation from him? A man with no heir? A man whose wife was barren? But the voice continued, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. He knew instantly. This was the one he had been searching for his entire life. Not an idol, not a myth, a living God. When he told Sarai, she looked at him with a mix of fear and awe. It was an impossible request. Leave everything? Their home, their family, their land, the city where they had grown up, the familiar comfort of the known world. But Sarai saw something in Abram's eyes, a certainty she had never seen before, a quiet, unshakable resolve. And though she feared the unknown, she loved Abram more than she feared uncertainty. So she gathered their belongings without protest. Their journey began in quiet steps, but with thunderous purpose. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran, following nothing but a voice and a promise. His nephew Lot traveled with them, along with servants, livestock, caravans of provisions. They moved slowly across rough landscapes, through deserts that burned their feet, through plains where the wind whipped against their tents, through hills and valleys untouched by civilization. Every step they took was a test of trust. Often, Abram found himself wondering where exactly this mysterious God was leading him. But every time doubt crept near, he looked up at the stars, the same stars that have called to him long before the voice ever spoke, and he knew he could not turn back. When they finally reached Canaan, the land was vast and wild, populated by tribes with customs and tongues foreign to Abram. Yet as he stood on one of the high ridges overlooking the land, the voice came to him again. To your offspring I will give this land. Offspring. The word stung, even as it filled him with hope. How could he have offspring when Sarai remained barren? He tried to push the question away, reminding himself that the one who called him was no ordinary deity. If God had spoken this promise, then it must be possible, somehow. Abram built an altar there, the first of many, marking not just a place but a moment. a declaration that he belonged not to Ur or Haran or Canaan, but to the God who had spoken life into his soul. Yet their faith would soon be tested. A famine swept through Canaan, turning fertile lands into cracked earth and wilting crops. The promise of God felt distant as hunger pushed Abram and Sarai toward Egypt, one of the few lands with food. Abram feared for Sarai's beauty, afraid the Egyptians might kill him to take her, so he asked her to say she was his sister. It was a moment of fear, a moment where the great Father of nations showed the weakness of ordinary men. And yet even there, even in his fear-driven mistake, God protected them, delivering them safely back to Canaan. Years passed. Abram grew older, Sarai grew older, and still the promise of a child remained unfulfilled. One night, Abram walked outside, overwhelmed by his unanswered longing, and cried out, "O Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" Then the voice spoke again, not in anger but in reassurance. "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. So shall your offspring be." Abram looked at the endless constellation above him, stars stretched like multitudes across the heavens, too numerous to count. And though it defied logic, defied nature, defied age, Abram believed. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. His faith was counted to him as righteousness. It was the beginning of a covenant, a bond forged not by ritual but by trust. But still, the child did not come. Sarai's hope began to fade like a candle burning low. In her desperation, she urged Abram to take her servant Hagar and have a child with her. It was a painful decision, rooted in sorrow, not malice. And though Abram agreed, the consequences would echo through generations. Ishmael was born, a son of Abram, but not the child of the promise. The years continued to pass, and by the time Abram was 99 years old, every biological possibility seemed gone. Yet at that moment, when all hope seemed dead, God appeared again, not with silence but with new life. He changed Abram's name to Abraham, father of many nations. He changed Sarai's name to Sarah, mother of nations, and he promised that within a year Sarah would bear a son. They both laughed, not in mockery, but in disbelief too beautiful to contain. And then Isaac was born, the child of laughter, the child of promise, the fulfillment of a decades-long journey of faith. But Abraham's greatest test, the one that would define him for all time, was still ahead. Isaac grew into a boy full of life, curiosity, and innocence. His laughter filled the camp like bright sunlight spilling through clouds. Sarah adored him with a fierce protectiveness, and Abraham watched him with awe, marveling at the miracle that had turned their old age into a beginning rather than an ending. Every time he looked into Isaac's eyes, he remembered the stars, those countless sparks that God had shown him on a night when he was filled with doubt. And each time Isaac took a step, laughed, or spoke his name, Abraham felt the weight of God's promise settle more deeply into his heart. The camp began to flourish around them. Servants tended to flocks, tents were pitched across the hillsides, and the sound of animals and work echoed through the valley. Abraham had wealth, honor, respect, yet none of it compared to the joy of having a son, the one he had waited a lifetime for. Isaac was everything he had hoped for, gentle, intelligent, thoughtful. There was a purity in his spirit that reminded Abraham of God's faithfulness. But perfection on earth is always temporary, and the true test of faith often reveals itself when everything seems finally at peace. One night, Abraham felt a familiar stirring in his soul, a presence approaching, unmistakable and heavy with purpose. He rose quietly from his bed, stepping outside beneath a sky shimmering with stars. The air was cool, the wind still. Sarah slept peacefully, unaware of the divine moment unfolding just beyond the tent. Then the voice came, clear as dawn breaking through darkness. "Abraham." He swallowed. "Here I am." Silence pressed against him, thick and sacred. Then the words came, words that would tear through the core of his being. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The universe seemed to fall silent. Abraham felt his breath leave him. His heart twisted painfully inside his chest. Isaac, the child of promise? The son born against all odds, through laughter, through miracle, through prophecy? The one whose existence was the foundation of God's covenant? The command felt impossible. cruel, unthinkable. His knees weakened, and for a moment he felt like the ground would swallow him. He closed his eyes, trying desperately to understand. Was this truly God? Was this a test, a punishment, a withdrawal of the promise? But the voice had been unmistakable. The same voice that had called him out of Ur, that had guided him through deserts and famine, that had promised him stars without number. That voice had now asked for the unthinkable. Abraham stood for a long time, trembling in the moonlight. Tears gathered in his eyes but refused to fall. If he had been a younger man, he might have questioned God. But this was not the Abraham who had wrestled with doubt in his younger years. This was a man who had walked with God for decades, who had seen miracles unfold in impossible moments. He didn't understand the command, but he trusted the one who had spoken it. His hands shook as he returned inside the tent. He lay beside Sarah, listening to her soft breathing. He could not tell her, he could not burden her with this. It would break her heart instantly. And so he closed his eyes and waited for dawn, though he did not sleep. When morning finally came, Abraham rose early. He tried to move without emotion, without allowing himself to think too deeply. Every thought felt like a knife carving into his chest. He saddled the donkey. He split the wood for the offering. He called 2 of his servants. And then, with a voice that cracked despite his effort, he called Isaac. "Come, my son. We are going to offer a sacrifice." Isaac smiled, eager to travel with his father. The innocence in his expression nearly crushed Abraham. The boy ran to him, full of excitement, unaware of the storm inside his father's heart. They set out on the journey, walking through valleys and rocky hills. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Abraham's mind battled between agony and obedience. Every night, he watched Isaac sleep, memorizing his face, his breathing, his peace. Every morning he rose again, forcing himself to continue toward the mountain God had chosen. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw it, the hill rising in the distance like a silent sentinel. His heart tightened painfully. He turned to the servants and said, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and we will return. We will return." Did he speak out of habit, out of hope, or out of faith that God would not break his promise? Perhaps it was all 3. Abraham placed the wood on Isaac's back. Isaac held it without question. Abraham carried the knife and the fire in a small vessel. As they began to climb, Isaac looked around curiously and asked, "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham stopped, closing his eyes in pain. The question pierced deeper than any blade. He steadied his voice with effort. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." Isaac accepted the answer without hesitation. His trust in his father was complete and pure. They reached the top of the mountain, where the wind blew fiercely and the landscape spread in every direction. Abraham built an altar stone by stone, each one feeling heavier than the last. Isaac watched, unaware of the meaning behind his father's shaking hands. When the altar was finished, Abraham turned to Isaac. The moment he had feared collapsed into reality. His voice broke as he whispered Isaac's name. The boy looked at him with trust, not fear. And in that moment, just from that innocent gaze, Abraham's heart splintered. He reached toward Isaac slowly, his hands trembling, tears finally escaping from his eyes. Isaac's expression shifted from confusion to shock, but he did not resist. Whether it was trust in his father, or trust in God, or simply the innocence of a young spirit, he allowed himself to be bound. Abraham tied the ropes around Isaac gently, as if afraid to cause him pain. His tears fell onto the knots. He lifted his son onto the altar, placing him on the wood he had carried moments earlier. Isaac's face was pale, his breath shaky, but he said nothing. Abraham stepped back, lifting the knife. Time seemed to stop. The world fell silent. The wind stilled. Even the sun seemed to hesitate. Then, a voice shattered the silence. "Abraham! Abraham!" He froze mid-motion, his entire body trembling violently. "Here I am," he choked. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not harm him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham collapsed in relief, sobs breaking from deep within him. Isaac gasped for breath, tears filling his eyes. Abraham quickly untied him, hugging him tightly, pressing his forehead against his son's. Then Abraham lifted his eyes. and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. God had provided. He offered the ram in Isaac's place. His hands were steady now, not from strength but from gratitude. When the smoke of the offering rose into the sky, Abraham felt peace return to his soul. A peace so profound, it felt like stepping into the presence of God himself. And then the voice spoke again, this time with power that shook the very air. "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I swear by myself, I will bless you. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. All nations on earth will be blessed through your offspring." The covenant was sealed. Isaac lived. Faith prevailed. And Abraham's obedience became the defining moment of his life, one that would echo through ages. The memory of Moriah did not fade when Abraham and Isaac returned home. It lived between them like a quiet, sacred flame, never spoken of casually, never laughed about, never forgotten. Isaac walks differently afterward, not because of fear, but because he had seen how close life truly sits beside death. He had stood between obedience and annihilation, between the knife and the promise. And Abraham watched him with a tenderness that bordered on awe. This boy, this promised son, had shown a depth of trust few men ever achieved in an entire lifetime. Together, father and son had been carved by God into something new. Many people imagine that after such a test, Abraham lived in constant peace. But the truth is more complicated. Life did not smooth out simply because the most dramatic trial had passed. The rest of Abraham's days were shaped by both loss and fulfillment, by sorrow and blessing, by the echo of God's voice and the quietness that followed it. Sarah, Abraham's beloved companion through deserts and kingdoms, through promises and impossibilities, grew old. And when her time came to leave the world, Abraham felt a pain sharper than anything he had faced on Moriah. The grief was heavier because he had loved her so fiercely. This was the woman who had laughed at the promise of God and then held that promise in her arms. She had walked beside Abraham through lands and dangers unknown, and he remembered every step. Isaac mourned with him, and the household felt the silence of a woman whose strength had held them all together. Abraham rose from his mourning, determined to honor Sarah properly. He asked the Hittites for a burial site, not a borrowed tomb, not a temporary resting place, but a permanent one, something that declared, "My family belongs here. God's promise roots us in this land." He purchased the cave of Machpelah, and Sarah was laid to rest. The gesture was more than grief. It was Abraham planting a flag into God's covenant soil, a declaration that faith was not only spoken but embodied. In the years that followed, Abraham worried for Isaac. He knew that the promise could not continue unless Isaac had a wife, someone who would share the covenant, believe in the God who had formed this family, and walk with Isaac into a destiny that stretched beyond nations and centuries. But Abraham refused to let his son marry from the Canaanite tribes around them. He wanted Isaac's future anchored in the same heritage that had shaped his own beginnings. So he sent his servant, the trusted elder of his household, back to his homeland to find the right woman. That journey too was guided by divine fingerprints. The servant prayed simply that the right woman would reveal herself not through beauty or wealth, but through kindness. Kindness to a stranger, kindness that overflowed without hesitation. And Rebekah appeared, meeting that prayer with precision. She drew water for the servant, then drew even more for all his camels, working until the animals drank their fill. This was a heart shaped for Isaac, a heart that understood generosity and duty. When Rebekah agreed to return, her family blessed her with words that echoed the destiny of Abraham himself. "May you become the mother of thousands of millions." And when she approached Isaac across the field, something quiet and sacred passed between them. Isaac took her as his wife, and the grief he carried for his mother softened through the comfort Rebekah brought into his life. But Abraham's story was not finished. God had promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. And while Isaac was the child of promise, Abraham also fathered other children in his old age through Keturah. Yet Abraham made sure that Isaac remained the covenant heir, the one through whom God's eternal promise would flow. As Abraham aged, his body slowed, but his faith did not dim. He remembered every altar, every moment when God's voice had broken into his world. He remembered leaving Ur, wandering through Canaan, negotiating with kings, pleading for Sodom, and lifting the knife over his beloved son. He remembered the laughter of Sarah, the first cry of Isaac, the covenant under the stars, and the God who had never abandoned him, not once. When Abraham's final day arrived, he breathed his last surrounded by the legacy he had fought for, wept for, and trusted God for. Isaac and Ishmael, two sons whose early stories were filled with tension, stood together to bury him beside Sarah. In that quiet act, something healing occurred. Two lines of heritage, though destined for different paths, honored the man who had given them life and faith. Abraham left the world, not as a perfect man, not as a sinless man, but as a friend of God. A man who dared to trust when trust made no sense. A man who obeyed when obedience hurt. A man who stepped into the unknown and built a story that would ripple through nations, empires, religions, and millennia. His legacy was not merely in bloodlines, but in belief. Every person who has ever chosen faith over fear, obedience over comfort, or hope over despair, walks in Abraham's footsteps. Every individual who has stepped into the unknown because God whispered, "Go," inherits something of Abraham's courage. He became the father of nations not because of military conquests or royal lineage, but because he lived a life that proved one profound truth: trust in God shapes destinies far beyond what the human eye can see. But the story reaches its greatest weight in the shadow of Moriah. That mountain stands as a testament to a relationship defined by trust. A trust so deep it cut through fear, so honest it welcomed questions, so raw it demanded surrender. The test did not break Abraham, it revealed him. It did not destroy Isaac, it marked him. And it did not contradict God's character, it unveiled it. For centuries after, Moriah would echo in the hearts of prophets and poets, kings and priests. And one day, on another hill not far from it, another father would offer another son. Except this time, no ram would appear in the thicket, no voice would call, "Stop." This time, the sacrifice would be completed. Abraham's story, in its most mysterious form, was a shadow of a much greater love. But in his lifetime, Abraham understood only this, that God was trustworthy, even when the world trembled under the weight of his commands. And that trust became the fountainhead of nations. Isaac would carry Abraham's legacy forward, but before that legacy could flourish, he had to grow into the weight of it. And though Abraham was gone, Isaac still lived under the long shadow of his father's faith, a shadow both comforting and heavy. There were nights when he sat outside his tent, staring at the same stars God once pointed out to Abraham, feeling both small and chosen at the same time. The covenant was now his, but so was the responsibility, and responsibility has a way of pressing on the heart in ways youth does not anticipate. Isaac often wondered what his father had truly felt at Moriah. Abraham never spoke of the terror, never described the shaking in his hands or the pounding of his heart as he lifted the knife. He had protected Isaac from that memory, giving him only the simple truth: God will provide. It was only after Abraham's death that Isaac fully understood how those three words had shaped the destiny of their entire lineage. In fact, as the years passed, Isaac repeated them to himself when life grew uncertain, when the wells dried, when the land failed, or when the weight of leadership felt unbearable. Rebekah, too, stepped more firmly into her role as matriarch after Abraham's passing. She was young, but she carried a strength that did not falter easily. She had come from a household of cunning and negotiation, and she understood that God's promises required both patience and wisdom. She watched over Isaac, supported him, and began to shape the next generation of the covenant in ways she didn't yet realize. But the land of Canaan, though promised, was far from peaceful. Famine struck again, just as it had in the days of Abraham. Isaac felt the instinct to flee to Egypt, as his father had once done, but God spoke directly to him for the first time in his life. It was not a whisper or a nudge. It was a clear command: do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land where I tell you to stay. And with that command came reassurance: I will be with you and bless you. Hearing God's voice for himself shifted something inside Isaac. Until then, he had lived within the orbit of Abraham's relationship with God. Now he felt the first pulse of his own. Isaac stayed in Gerar among the Philistines, where the tension between trust and fear returned, just as it had for Abraham. Isaac, too, feared for his life because of Rebekah's beauty, and he told the people she was his sister. It was a moment that revealed Isaac's humanity, his flaws, his inherited fears, his struggle to fully embrace courage. Yet God protected him just as he had protected Abraham. Abimelech, king of the Philistines, discovered the truth and confronted Isaac, but instead of attacking him, he ordered the people to leave Isaac and Rebekah unharmed. This pattern, fear, failure, and divine rescue, showed that the covenant was upheld by God's faithfulness more than human perfection. Isaac planted crops in that land, and God blessed him 100-fold. His wealth grew, flocks, herds, servants, so much so that the Philistines became jealous. They filled the wells Abraham's servants had dug, forcing Isaac to move again and again. But Isaac refused to fight. Instead, he reopened the old wells and dug new ones. Each time conflict arose, he moved farther away until the hostility ceased. His gentleness, often mistaken for weakness, became a silent testimony that God was with him. Eventually, Abimelech himself approached Isaac, not with threats but with humility. "We see clearly that the Lord is with you," he said. A treaty was formed, and peace settled over Isaac's camp. It was then that God appeared again, reaffirming the covenant first spoken to Abraham. Isaac built an altar and called on the name of the Lord, just as his father had done. The legacy was alive, not as a memory but as a living promise. Meanwhile, the household grew more complex. Isaac and Rebekah longed for children, but like Abraham and Sarah, they faced barrenness. Isaac prayed earnestly, and God answered. Rebekah conceived, but the pregnancy was not peaceful. She felt turmoil inside her, a struggle beyond natural explanation. When she sought God, He revealed a prophecy that would shape the identity of two nations. "Two nations are in your womb, one will be stronger, and the older will serve the younger." Esau and Jacob were born, twins yet different in every possible way. Esau emerged first, red and strong, a hunter with a wild spirit. Jacob followed, grasping Esau's heel, a symbolic gesture that no one fully understood at the time. Isaac favored Esau, drawn to his strength and the taste of the wild game he brought home. Rebekah favored Jacob, seeing in him the quiet cunning and depth that mirrored her own family line. The rivalry that began in the womb grew sharper with time. Jacob was strategic, calculating opportunities. Esau was impulsive, driven by hunger and instinct. One day, Esau returned exhausted and found Jacob cooking a red stew. In a moment of desperation, Esau traded his birthright, his spiritual inheritance, for a bowl of food. It was a decision that revealed how lightly he regarded the sacred things of God. Isaac grew old, his eyesight fading, his voice slowing, and his mind drifting into memories of Abraham. He decided it was time to bless Esau, the firstborn, passing on the covenantal blessing. Yet Rebekah remembered God's prophecy, the older would serve the younger. She orchestrated a plan, one that would change the course of the covenant forever. Jacob disguised himself as Esau and received the blessing meant for his brother. The deception shattered the family's peace. Esau raged, vowing to kill Jacob. Rebekah, fearing for her son's life, sent Jacob away to her brother Laban. Isaac, though shaken, affirmed the blessing. What God had declared in the womb was now set in motion, though through painful circumstances. Jacob's departure marked another turning point in Abraham's legacy. The covenant was preserved, but at the cost of family harmony. Isaac spent his last years knowing that God's promise lived on, but longing for the unity that had slipped from his household. He and Rebekah aged quietly, carrying both the beauty and burden of the promise. The story of Abraham did not end with his death, nor with Isaac's quiet leadership. It continued through Jacob, who would wrestle with both man and God, who would be renamed Israel, whose sons would become the tribes that would carry the covenant into the unfolding centuries. But at the foundation of all that history, of all that struggle, redemption, and divine intervention, stood Abraham's faith, Isaac's obedience, and the everlasting God who shaped them both. Jacob's journey away from home was both an escape and a calling. He fled with fear at his back, knowing Esau's anger was real and deadly. Yet he also carried the invisible thread of destiny, the same thread that had pulled Abraham out of Ur and anchored Isaac through famine and uncertainty. Jacob was not yet the man he would become. He was cunning, clever, and desperate. But God does not choose perfect people, He shapes them. One night, exhausted and alone, Jacob rested his head on a stone in the open wilderness. The cold air wrapped around him, and the silence was heavy. Sleep came slowly, But when it did, Jacob was plunged into one of the most defining visions in biblical history. He saw a ladder or stairway reaching from the earth into heaven. Angels ascended and descended upon it, moving like living flames. And above it stood the Lord himself. "I am the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac," the voice said. "The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. I am with you and will keep you wherever you go." Jacob woke trembling. The wilderness that had felt empty and hostile now felt sacred. He whispered, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He took the stone he had slept on, set it upright, poured oil on it, and named the place Bethel, House of God. The covenant had now passed unmistakably to him. What had begun with Abraham and continued through Isaac was now written upon Jacob's life, even if Jacob did not fully understand the weight of it. But destiny does not erase difficulty. Jacob continued onward to his uncle Laban, unaware that he was about to meet someone whose cunning matched, even surpassed his own. When Jacob saw Rachel by the well, beautiful, radiant, full of life, his heart attached itself instantly. He worked with a vigor and enthusiasm that surprised the shepherds around him. Laban welcomed him warmly, but beneath the welcome was calculation. Jacob agreed to work 7 years to marry Rachel, years that felt like only days because of his love for her. But Laban, master of deception, switched Rachel with Leah, the older sister, on the wedding night. Jacob woke to heartbreak and shock. The deceiver had been deceived. Laban calmly offered him Rachel as well for another 7 years of labor. Jacob agreed. His love for Rachel outweighed the indignity he had suffered. And soon he found himself with 2 wives, then children, then complications, far too great for a man who had once fled simply to survive. Yet in that tangled household, the 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel were born. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, each of them representing a future nation, a future legacy, a future struggle. But Jacob's life was not only marked by multiplication, it was marked by transformation. After 20 years, God called him to return home to the land of his fathers. Fear resurfaced as he imagined facing Esau again. But this time, Jacob was not the same man who had fled years earlier. He had learned endurance, responsibility, humility, and patience. Still, fear clung to him like a shadow. On the night before his meeting with Esau, Jacob found himself alone again, just as he had been at Bethel. And once again, God stepped into his life in a way that defied all expectations. A man, mysterious, divine, overwhelming, appeared and wrestled with Jacob until dawn. This was not a dream. This was a physical, soul-shaking confrontation. Jacob wrestled with everything inside him: fear, guilt, ambition, deceit, destiny. The stranger saw Jacob's determination and touched his hip, wrenching it out of joint. Pain shot through Jacob's body, but he held on with something stronger than muscle. He held on with desperation for blessing, with hunger for a new name, a new identity, a new future. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he cried. The man asked his name, Jacob. The response came like a divine proclamation. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and with men, and have prevailed." Israel, the name that would echo through holy history, the name that would define a people, a nation, and a covenant. Jacob limped away from that encounter changed. He met Esau with humility, bowing to him 7 times, offering gifts, accepting peace. Esau embraced him, not with vengeance but with forgiveness. The past, once sharp and dangerous, softened into reconciliation. God had been at work not only in Jacob's heart but in Esau's as well. Jacob settled again in the land, building altars, digging wells, raising his family. But the legacy of Abraham was still unfolding. Joseph, one of Jacob's youngest sons, would rise to prominence in Egypt. The children of Israel would multiply. A famine would come, driving them into a foreign land. Centuries later, another leader, Moses, would deliver them, carrying forward the covenant that began in the heart of Abraham. But though the story extends far beyond one man, the thread always returns to Abraham, the father of nations, the man whose trust unlocked destinies. His life remains a model for every generation because every person, whether in ancient deserts or modern cities, faces moments when God calls them into the unknown, asks them to hold on to promises that seem impossible, or calls them to sacrifice something they love deeply. Abraham's story is not merely ancient history, it is the blueprint of faith itself. A blueprint built on trust, obedience, and surrender. A blueprint that shaped Isaac's calm strength and Jacob's relentless transformation. A blueprint that still speaks, still challenges, still comforts. Abraham is remembered not because he lived without struggle, but because he trusted in the midst of struggle. Not because he was flawless, but because he allowed God to shape him. And so the story of Abraham, the father of nations, remains one of the clearest reflections of what it means to walk with God. To believe when belief costs you something, to obey when obedience hurts, and to trust when you cannot see the road ahead. As generations passed, the memory of Abraham did not fade, it deepened. Around campfires, beneath open skies, fathers retold his story to their sons. The night God led him outside to count the stars, the trembling walk up Moriah, the ram caught in the thicket, the covenant sealed not by human effort but divine grace. Mothers whispered his name when praying for their children, reminding them that they too were part of a promise older than empires. But those stories were not simply tales of the past. They shaped identity, responsibility, and hope. Abraham became the anchor for an entire people, a reference point for what faith could look like in human form. He had challenges, doubts, missteps, and moments of weakness, yet God remained faithful. That truth resonated through every generation that followed. Long after Abraham and Isaac were gone, and Jacob's sons became a vast community, the land God promised was still contested, still filled with uncertainty. The people of Israel found themselves caught in cycles of faithfulness and rebellion, courage and fear. When their trust faltered, prophets would rise and point them back to Abraham. Look to the rock from which you were hewn. They reminded the people that they came from a man who stepped into the impossible, trusting the one who commanded it. Centuries later, even when Israel was enslaved in Egypt, the memory of Abraham remained at the heart of their identity. God spoke to Moses from the burning bush, introducing himself not merely as creator, but as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was Abraham's name that reminded Moses and Israel that God does not forget his promises, no matter how much time has passed or how dark the circumstances become. And when Moses stood before Pharaoh demanding the freedom of his people, it was because God remembered Abraham. When the Red Sea parted, when manna fell from the sky, when water burst from the rock in the desert, all of it flowed from a covenant that began with a man who dared to believe. Even the laws given at Sinai, the commandments carved into stone, were rooted in the promise that began with Abraham. The people were not simply a wandering tribe anymore, they were a nation formed by God, tied to a destiny that reached back into the heart of Abraham's obedience. But the story stretched further still. Generations after Moses, when Israel demanded a king, God chose David, a shepherd boy with a heart tuned to his voice. And to David, God made another promise, that from his lineage would come a king whose kingdom would never end. This promise too echoed Abraham's, for both men were chosen not for perfection, but for faith. Every thread of Israel's history, judges, kings, exiles, prophets, wound back to Abraham, the father of their faith. And still, the story was not complete. Much later, in a quiet town far from the wealth and power of kings, a child was born whose lineage could be traced directly to Abraham. His birth was simple, unnoticed by most, but heaven understood its significance. Angels announced his arrival to shepherds. Wise men traveled from distant lands to honor him. This child would grow into a man who spoke with an authority no one had ever heard before, an authority that stirred hearts and unsettled empires. He healed the sick, restored the broken, and called people back to the God of Abraham. And when he taught, he spoke of Abraham not as a distant figure, but as a living witness of faith. "Abraham rejoiced to see my day," he said. Those words carried a weight few could comprehend. For this man, Jesus was the fulfillment of everything God promised Abraham. Through him, all nations of the earth would indeed be blessed. In Jesus, the story of Abraham reached its climax. The faith Abraham displayed on Moriah became a foreshadowing of a sacrifice far greater. Where Abraham was stopped, God went all the way. Where Abraham lifted the knife but did not strike, God freely gave his son. The ram caught in the thicket pointed toward a future moment when a perfect sacrifice would take the place of humanity's guilt. Abraham did not understand the full picture during his lifetime, but he walked faithfully nonetheless. And because of that faith, the world received hope. This is the depth of Abraham's legacy. His trust became the foundation of redemption history. His obedience opened a door through which God poured out blessing across centuries, cultures, and continents. His story is not trapped in the past. It still pulses with relevance, challenging every person who hears it to consider what faith truly looks like. Faith, according to Abraham's life, is not merely believing in God's existence. It is believing God's word even when everything around you contradicts it. It is stepping into the unknown when God says, "Go." It is letting go of the familiar for the sake of the eternal. It is holding on to promises that seem impossible because you trust the character of the one who made them. And it is surrendering even what you love most when God asks, believing that He is good even when the request breaks your understanding. That is what defined Abraham. That is what shaped Isaac. That is what transformed Jacob into Israel. And that is what every generation after them was called to remember. The story of Abraham is the story of a man whose yes to God changed the world. A man who built altars more often than excuses. A man who trusted God even when God led him up a mountain with a knife in his hand and tears on his face. A man who believed that God could bring life out of barrenness, nations out of one child, hope out of despair. And through that man, God shaped a people. And through that people, God shaped history. And through that history came a Savior. Abraham's legacy stretches into eternity, a reminder that one person's obedience can echo far beyond their lifetime. His life urges us to ask difficult yet necessary questions. What promises has God placed before us that we are afraid to embrace? What steps into the unknown have we avoided because comfort feels safer than calling? What sacrifices are we unwilling to make, even when we sense God asking us to trust? Abraham shows us that faith does not remove uncertainty, it overcomes it. Faith does not eliminate fear, it courageously walks through it. Faith does not demand to understand everything, it believes that God understands enough for both. His story teaches us that the greatest tests produce the greatest revelations. Without Moriah, Abraham would have remained a man of faith, yes, but Moriah made him the father of nations. Without surrender, there would be no legacy. And so, as the story comes to its close, we remember him not only for who he was, but for who God was to him, a faithful friend, a promise maker, a promise keeper, a guide through deserts, a shield against kings, a voice in the night, a provider on the mountain. The God of Abraham remains the same today, calling people into destinies they cannot yet see, shaping them through trials they do not fully understand, and weaving their obedience into a story far larger than themselves. And though Abraham's journey ended long ago, the essence of his faith continues to breathe through every generation that reflects on his story. His footsteps in the dust of ancient Canaan have become spiritual footprints embedded in the hearts of millions. His trials, though rooted in a distant era, mirror the struggles people still face today. Uncertainty, delay, doubt, sacrifice, and the search for meaning in the quiet places of the soul. People look at Abraham and see a man who dared to trust when common sense failed. A man who walked toward a destiny he could not yet see. A man who built a life on promises instead of proofs. This is why Abraham's story still resonates, because deep down, every person longs to know whether the risks they take in obedience, the sacrifices they make for love, and the faith they carry through hardship are truly seen by God. Abraham's life answers that longing. His story says, yes. Yes, God sees. Yes, God hears. Yes, God remembers. Yes, God provides. That truth becomes even clearer when we look at the patterns woven through Abraham's relationships, especially his relationship with Sarah. She was not merely a companion, she was a partner in the promise, a witness to both the laughter and the sorrow. Her barrenness, decade after decade, became a weight she carried quietly, even as she watched Abraham build altars and renew his hope. Yet in the end, when hope seemed unreasonable, God fulfilled his word. Their shared laughter at the birth of Isaac was not only joy, it was vindication. It was proof that waiting is not wasted when God is the one who gives the promise. The laughter of Isaac echoed into the future, touching generations that had yet to exist. The name Isaac, meaning he will laugh, carried with it the memory of a God who transforms sorrow into joy, confusion into clarity, and impossibility into testimony. And that promise did not end with Isaac. It continued through Jacob, who carried the weight of destiny in ways he could not yet comprehend. But Jacob's journey was not easy. His life reminds us that the promise was not inherited through perfection, but through perseverance. He wrestled, deceived, ran, returned, suffered, and hoped. Through all of it, God remained faithful. This pattern, human weakness met by divine faithfulness, became the signature of the Abrahamic covenant. As the lineage grew, so did the responsibilities placed upon it. The tribes that formed from Jacob's sons were not simply family groups, they were carriers of a divine mission. Each tribe had a purpose, a destiny, a role in the unfolding story of God's interaction with humanity. Their struggles in Egypt, their deliverance, their wilderness wandering, and their settlement in the Promised Land were all echoes of Abraham's original journey. God had promised Abraham land, descendants, and blessing. That blessing was never meant to be stagnant. It was designed to flow outward like a river reaching distant lands. The nations surrounding Israel were meant to see the glory of God through the lives of Abraham's children, through their justice, mercy, faithfulness, and worship. Even when Israel faltered, even when they chased after idols and forgot their calling, God continued to send prophets to remind them, "You are the children of Abraham, return to the covenant." Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel carried Abraham's name as a banner of hope. When Israel faced exile, when foreign armies tore down their walls and scattered them, God still spoke through his messengers, promising restoration not because of Israel's goodness, but because of his covenant with Abraham. That covenant was a thread that could not be severed by human failure. It stretched across centuries, pulling a broken people toward redemption. And then, in the fullness of time, that thread led to Jesus, the descendant of Abraham, the fulfillment of the promise, the blessing to all nations. Jesus carried the weight of the covenant in his words, his miracles, his compassion, his sacrifice. When he taught about faith, he pointed back to Abraham. When he confronted the religious leaders, he reminded them that Abraham's faith was rooted in humility, not pride. Jesus brought clarity to what Abraham had only glimpsed. He revealed that the true children of Abraham were not those born merely by blood, but those who lived by the same faith. The faith that acts, trusts, surrenders, and obeys. And in this way, Abraham became not just a patriarch of ancient Israel, but a father of faith for countless believers across cultures and nations. His story, though grounded in the soil of antiquity, continues to shape lives today. People still look to his example when they are called to leave what is familiar. They pray for answers in seasons of silence. They face tests that seem unfair or overwhelming. They must choose trust over fear. They feel unseen, forgotten, or hopeless. Abraham's life whispers, "Hold on," but God who promised is faithful. And so the legacy continues, not as a relic of the past, but as a living testimony. But God who called Abraham still calls people today. He still leads them into futures they cannot yet see. He still transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary stories of courage, trust, and redemption. And as long as people continue to wrestle with faith, Abraham's story will continue to guide them. It will continue to challenge them to trust more deeply, surrender more fully, and walk more boldly into the unknown with the confidence that God walks beside them. For Abraham's story is not simply history, it is a living invitation, an invitation to step onto the path of faith, to follow the voice of God, to believe that even in the darkest valley there is purpose. It is a reminder that every test holds revelation, every sacrifice holds blessing, and every step of obedience carries eternal significance. Abraham was not perfect, but he was willing. He did not know everything, but he trusted. He did not see the full picture, but he walked forward anyway. And because of that, nations were born, histories were written, promises were fulfilled, and salvation entered the world. This is the power of one life fully surrendered to God. This is the power of Abraham's story, and this is the power of faith that endures. And so Abraham stood on the heights of his old age, looking back at the winding path that had carried him from Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, from Canaan to Egypt, and back again to the land where every promise seemed to hang between the visible and the invisible. He had walked through droughts, conflicts, separations, wars, betrayals, miracles, laughter, and heartbreak. He had held the weight of God's promises in his hands, even when those promises seemed as fragile as dust. Yet through every moment of uncertainty, through every night when he stared into the sky and wondered how stars too many to count could ever come from a life that had once felt empty, he had remained tethered to a faith that refused to die. In the quiet of his final years, Abraham often revisited that moment on the mountain with Isaac. He would sit beneath the shade of a tree and recall the feeling of the knife in his shaking hand, the voice that broke through the silence, the ram caught in the thicket, and the overwhelming flood of relief that nearly brought him to his knees. He understood now that the test had never been about the sacrifice of Isaac. It had been about the posture of his heart. It had been about trust, pure, unshaken trust in the one who had called him out of everything familiar. And Abraham knew he had not been alone on that mountain. God had been there, watching, guiding, providing. The test had shaped him, purified him, defined him in a way no victory or blessing ever could. As the years passed, Abraham's children and grandchildren grew into tribes, and the tribes would one day grow into nations. Isaac would become the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of 12 sons whose names would echo through history. Every time Abraham saw Isaac speaking with the young men of the household, or walking through the fields with Sarah's familiar spark in his eyes, he felt a sense of completion, a deep knowing that the promise was alive. He lived long enough to see generations begin to blossom, to see the foundations of a people forming stone by stone, just as God had declared on the day he called him to leave everything behind. When Abraham finally breathed his last, he did so in peace, surrounded by the legacy he had once only imagined. He closed his eyes, knowing that his life had not been defined by his wealth, his flocks, his journeys, or even the land he walked on. His life had been defined by faith, faith that honored God, faith that shaped nations, faith that outlived him. And though centuries would pass and empires would rise and fall, the story of Abraham would remain, whispered from generation to generation, not simply as the tale of a man blessed beyond measure, but as the story of a heart that surrendered fully to God's calling. For in the end, Abraham became the father of nations, not because of his bloodline, but because of his obedience. And the test on the mountain, the moment when everything hung in the balance, became the defining turning point, not only in his life, but in the future of millions who would trace their spiritual heritage back to him. His journey was a testament to the power of trust, the endurance of promise, and the unfolding of a divine plan that no human eye could ever fully comprehend. Through Abraham's life, the world learned that faith is not simply belief, it is action, sacrifice, and surrender. And his name would be remembered forever as the man who walked with God, even when he could not see the path ahead.